Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to History Matters. And so does coffee. And I brilliantly did not adjust my view here. Okay. So thank you for joining us. We are going to be talking about the press and Kansas. And I'll offer just for a moment or two at the beginning of the episode, once we get underway, where this came from. It should be kind of obvious in what I suggested in the title. But before I launch into that, I will turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History, and I love spending every Friday here with Joanne and John and all of you. We have a great chat going on already for those of you who are tuning in through Zoom, and I've been told that Facebook has a similar little group. Someday I'm trying to figure out how we can get all those people together. But if you have questions, and I know today's topic, we're going to have lots of great questions, please look down towards the bottom of your screen and look for the Q&A box. That's where we need you to put your questions. And I will come back in about 30 minutes and Joanne and I will go through the questions. See you in a little bit.
Okay. And I will say too, anyone who is here for the first time, please let us know, put it in chat, make sure that you're in chat, that you have your settings, that you're chatting to everyone, since we have such a robust community here. But if you tell folks in chat that you are here for the first time, you will get from the robust community a robust welcome. Okay, so Kansas and the press. Obviously, the first half of the story is something that we all know about, probably, and I'll come back to the details of that. The search of a newspaper in Marion County, Kansas. Yesterday, and I actually should say, last week I actually sent out to every social media platform in the universe, what do you want to hear about this week on History Matters? And I got a slew of suggestions, really interesting, but a couple people said, I don't know, freedom of the press. That might be a good one. So starting with Marion County, Kansas, I thought to myself, okay, Freeman, scroll back in your brain. When can you think of a moment, not only when the press is involved in some kind of suppressive or violent or some episode I could make a link to, but when official people were involved, right? And in this case, you had the police with a magistrate judge giving an order for this to happen. So I wanted to find something similar when, in one way or another, the government was attacking or suppressing or searching a newspaper. And lo and behold, the image that came into my head was something from Benjamin Brown French, the sort of star of my last book, The Field of Blood. And he describes, I think it's like the second page of the epilogue or something. He describes, he's taking account of the money that people are requesting to compensate them for all of the violence in Kansas. And there's an image somehow or other mixed in there of sort of marauders with, I believe it is books on their bayonets, having attacked, I can't even remember if it's a newspaper office or a house, but the image that came to my mind when I was thinking of Marion County was that. And I thought, oh, Kansas, of course, silly Joanne, Kansas. And then I realized I'm going to be talking about Kansas, and it's kind of a wonderful, to me, surprising link, just because it's so obvious, and I hadn't thought of it. Okay, so very briefly about what happened in Marion County. All of everything that happened there and that we've been hearing about started regarding, and I will say actually at the outset here, there are still details of what happened there that are being argued about. So I'm not going to claim that anything that I'm saying here, as far as details, most of them is absolute. You know, who leaked what to who, what did the leak say? You try Googling it and you'll find out as well that, and then I think maybe it's the police chief who's like, when all the details are known, this will be vindicated. At any rate, I'm going to sketch this out for you. So I should say the Marion County Record, which is the newspaper whose offices were searched, has 7 employees. Okay, Marion County is not a huge place. And I should say the Marion County Record is, I suppose, kind of known for fiery editorials about local officials. So it's a aggressive sort of newspaper, not a rabble-rousing newspaper, but not a shy newspaper. Now, supposedly, the newspaper had gotten some kind of government record about, I don't even have all the details here. I brilliantly didn't write down, someone write it down, because I brilliantly didn't write down who it was about. That had, I'm waiting for the chat because I missed this crucial detail. Anyway, I'll go on without it and maybe I'll see it in chat. The newspaper got a government record about a local official that talked about her attempt to restore her driver's license. Local restaurant owner. Oh, I did write her down somewhere. Okay, a local restaurant owner. Okay, that'll come back too. Thank you very much. That she had DUIs, that she was trying to restore her driver's license. Supposedly, someone from the press gave that to a city councilwoman. The press says, no, it didn't. So again, the details here, I don't know. So a magistrate judge signed off on this search of the Marion County Records offices. It was not an announced search. It was an unannounced. It was a surprise search. They entered the offices, seized computers, cell phones, any number of other things. And I should say that the newspaper, the Marion County Record, apparently pulled together enough equipment that they put out another edition of the newspaper not that long after this, not the same day, but not that long after this. And the headline in a huge font says, "Seized, but not silenced," which I appreciate the sentiment there. Now, supposedly the most recent detail here is that the top prosecutor in Marion County, Kansas, says there actually was not enough evidence to support the search at all, and all the materials are being returned to the Marion County Record. So obviously this, for any number of reasons, has gotten a lot of press, and it should. It was a police department. It was, in one way or another, the government allowing, encouraging, and taking part in the search of a newspaper office and the seizure of its materials. That's not something that happens in the United States very often. I'm going to come back to that at the end as to what it means. But it's shocking because it's reminiscent of what happens under authoritarian governments when a newspaper says something that people in charge don't like. So they attack the newspaper, attack journalists, shut down newspapers. It's what you do when you're trying to shut up the press. And a free press, First Amendment, folks, free press is the essence, or I won't even say the essence, part of the essence of what supports democratic governance. We, as the American people, need to understand what's happening in government. One of the fundamental ways in which we find that out is through the press. Now, we are living in an age when we have to sift through a lot of press to figure out what's true and what isn't, and it's hard, and we talk about that all the time here on History Matters. But regardless, a free press from all the way back at the beginning is seen as centrally, vitally important to American democratic governance. Okay, so put Marion County in your mind. Let's go back to Lawrence, Kansas in May of 1856. Now, at this period of time, what we're talking about is a struggle over whether Kansas is going to be a free state or a slave state. And Lawrence, the town of Lawrence, Kansas, was founded by anti-slavery settlers who wanted Kansas to be a free state. Pro-slavery settlers, and in particular, Douglas County Sheriff Samuel Jones really didn't like that, didn't like the fact that it existed. And as you'll see in a moment, it sort of comes to the fore because of a series of events. So supposedly, Mr. Sheriff Samuel Jones had come to Lawrence to make some arrests. There was a fight, not even in Lawrence, over some land, and there was one of the people fighting for ownership of land was a Free State supporter, and the sheriff Jones had come to Lawrence to arrest someone who had helped the guy involved with the land, what do I want to call it, struggle. I think I need more coffee. So Jones comes to Lawrence to make an arrest, and to make an arrest of a Free State proponent. A crowd in Lawrence disarmed Jones, disarmed his assistant, and they didn't make the arrest. One Free State newspaper joked that when Jones called for help, he didn't say for who, so Lawrence citizens helped the guy supposedly being arrested. Now, Jones, a few days later, tried again to make an arrest. This time he brought government troops with him. He did arrest a few men, but when he was camped a little bit outside of Lawrence, Kansas, he was shot, not fatally, but he was shot. Free State, this is going to have interestingly modern echoes. Free State leaders in Kansas immediately recognized that this guy came with government troops and was shot, and this was going to be potentially trouble. So people in Lawrence denounced the shooting, acknowledged that it was bad, it shouldn't have happened. Some in Lawrence even claimed, and this is the part with the echo, some in Lawrence even claimed that actually a pro-slavery group had carried out the shooting to make trouble. It wasn't anti-slavery people at all. It was a conspiracy. Just think about that for a little bit. At any rate, the people in Lawrence, Kansas were correct. This was not going to go well. So territorial Judge Samlin Lecomte charged a grand jury with indicting Free State officials in Lawrence and stopping its Free State newspapers, right? So if they're trying to tamp down the Free State town of Kansas, stopping the newspapers is a good way. So now Jones and a federal marshal assemble an army of 800, obviously pro-slavery settlers, and they plan to disarm citizens, to destroy newspapers. The point of this was not to harm people. It was to intimidate people to make a statement and destroy newspapers. And I'm generalizing here, but that's important. This wasn't an attempt to hurt anyone. And actually, one person ends up being killed, but he's killed when a piece of masonry falls off a building. I believe it's a hotel that's burning, falls on his head and kills him. So there aren't any deaths here, but that's not the point. They're not trying to hurt people. They're trying to make a point and silence the press. They blocked the roads leaving out of Lawrence so people couldn't leave to help in the disarming of citizens of Lawrence, Kansas. And they halted production of two anti-slavery newspapers, the Kansas Free State and the Herald of Freedom. The Kansas Free State never came back, never restored itself. The Herald of Freedom did reestablish itself, but it took a few months to collect itself and come back. So the town is savaged. The machinery, the presses, and the newspaper offices are destroyed. Type for setting the newspapers is thrown in the river. Basically, the press offices, the newspaper offices are truly destroyed, but there are other things burned and attacked in the town. That's why it's called the sacking of Lawrence. Now, interestingly, so think about now the reaction to what happened in Marion County, the Marion County Record, and think of the way in which there's a justified uproar against what happened. In the case of Lawrence, Kansas, people on the Free State side immediately recognized this is a moral victory for them. And it shifted in some ways, public opinion shifted in some ways from dislike of Free State defiance of territorial law to admiration in the restraint of Lawrence, Kansas for not responding to the violence. So this statement, a statement is made in Lawrence, and some people watch that statement be made, watch how people are responding to it, and say, you know what, we don't like this. We don't like this at all. They're not necessarily saying, free the press, but the press was a specific target. Now, the news of this obviously gets out. The press, North and South, talks about what happens in extreme language. There's a lot of intense emotion. And there's not a direct link between the sacking of Lawrence and the caning of Charles Sumner, but they're only several days apart. So what you are seeing, if you're there in that time period, is pro-slavery forces, or the South, beating Free State people or an abolitionist senator in one way or another to the ground, right? So a statement is being made, and that's quite a statement, and it gets quite a response. See, I'm getting near the end of my time. Now, I want to say, and this is important, in talking about these two examples, I'm not saying that the fight against slavery in Kansas is equivalent to the debate over this document and who leaked it and what happened. The implications are huge, but the details, I'm not equating the two incidents on a specific level. That they're different in countless ways. But I am trying to make several points. And one of them is the one that I just made, which is this kind of statement. And in Marion County, it wasn't necessarily violent, but it was something that doesn't typically take place in the United States. And let me read you a statement actually from the Washington Post about this, since they say it much better than I do. The Washington Post says, police raids on news organizations are almost unknown in the United States and are illegal under most circumstances under state and federal law. Quote, this shouldn't happen in America, said Emily Bradbury, the executive director of the Kansas Press Association, in an interview Sunday. She added, freedom of the press is fundamental to our democracy. We're not going to let this stand on our watch. Bradbury said the newspaper's records could have been obtained via a subpoena, a court-ordered command for specific material that is subject to legal objections, not an unannounced search, which is a good point. Okay, so what happened to the Marion County record is a violation of the sensibility import of the First Amendment. It's in one way or another trying to threaten or intimidate the press. And again, as this person who works for the Kansas Press Association said, they could have subpoenaed something, they could have asked for something, but the police attacked, or okay, I won't say attacked, that's an inflammatory word, searched and seized materials from the newspaper office, right? That's extreme in this case. And it is as I said, whether they wanted it to be or not, and I think they did. If you do that sort of thing and you know that there are gentler ways of getting what you want, that's a statement, particularly given that this newspaper, The Record, had a reputation for having strong opinions. That's a statement that you better watch out, press. We don't like what you did. We're going to tell you we don't like what you did, which in a sense is a very similar message that was sent in the sacking of Lawrence, Kansas. And in both cases, that kind of attack, that kind of attempt prompts a lot of reaction. A lot of people who recognize, just as the Washington Post notes, that kind of police raid on a news organization, that's not something that happens all that often in the United States, and for good reason. for all kinds of reasons, having to do with the free press, having to do with what the police can and can't do, having to do with the fact that the rule of law and judicial movements, judicial, what do I want to say, motions of sorts, can come in and not get you far away from the idea of having to raid a newspaper office. In both cases, people in power tried to silence the press. People in power, or people who wanted power, so let's say in Kansas, it was pro-slavery people who wanted to silence free state people, who had some territorial, parts of the territorial government on their side, attack Lawrence, Kansas, and try to silence the press. The police and this magistrate judge, and official forces of sorts, attack the record. There's a sheriff even leading folks into Lawrence, Kansas. So you have, in one way or another, people in power who are trying to silence the press. In essence, people in power trying to influence the power of the press. They don't control the power. People in power should not control the press. That's why we call it a free press, right? The press should be ideally reporting, investigating, telling people what's actually happening in government and elsewhere, so that we can see it, so that we can think about it, so that we can evaluate those who we've given power to, and take that power away if they're not using it responsibly or as we might wish. And obviously, there are all kinds of subjective things there about what's being put in the newspaper, what different people might wish, but still, a free press is, initially in the early republic, some people almost considered it a fourth branch of the government, vital in the accountability component of democratic governance. And I've talked about accountability many, many, many times. Okay, so that's my larger point here, is that number one, both of these attacks are very strong statements. Both of them, in one way or another, are on the one hand are trying to silence the press, but also are sending a very strong message of intimidation. In both cases, there are pesky people who are saying things or doing things that some people in power don't necessarily like and really want to silence. In both cases, it's not about violence. It's about information. It's about the reach of these newspapers. It's about a broader kind of fight that goes beyond the newspapers. And in the case of Kansas, it goes far beyond even Kansas. But still, you can see the echoes of these things. You can see the recognition, and this is not a new idea, of course, that a free press is important. But what you can also see is these very obvious attempts, on the one hand, to silence a free press or intimidate them into backing away. And the fact that Americans recognize the problem inherent in that, the importance of that, and how important it is to be watchful for a free press, watchful for this sort of thing, watchful for people who are trying to silence people they disagree with, or for that matter, ban books they don't like, or stop people from teaching certain AP history courses. People who are trying to shut people up, hold people back, keep words away from people. Those people are people who want control, and in one way or another, words are pesky. Words can get in the way. So that's maybe my overall argument here, is that there are any number of things, and I've talked about them before. I'll talk about them again this morning when I was thinking about a free press and how, in a sense, this is an attack on the idea of a free press. I also thought about the fact that protest, our right to protest, also in the recent or semi-recent past, is seemingly under attack. Like, what is allowable, what isn't allowable, some deliberately blurred lines, people being arrested when they're normally not arrested, like journalists. that these are rights, our rights, that we have to watch, that we have to protect, and that we have to prevent from being violated. So you may say to yourself, oh, come on, there's 7 people employed at the Marion County Record. It's not the size that matters. It's the implication. It's the message. And it's that message linked to a broader pattern that matters. Okay. I even finished 1 minute early. I didn't see, oh, okay, thank you. I see one mug. I said, normally, if there's anyone here who's new, people begin demanding, I'm wiping my lipstick off the mug. People begin demanding this week's mug at the end. And I know I'm near the end because I see mug.
Never ended early. This is like a new milestone.
I know, 1 minute early.
Write that down, somebody.
Pardon?
I said, write that down, somebody, because in a couple of weeks we'll say, which episode did we end a minute early?
Yeah,
It'll be
I
on
don't
a
think that's
spreadsheet
happened before.
somewhere.
It's true. I don't think that's happened before. Okay, this mug I have used before, but you might not remember because I haven't used it in a while. And I'm gonna have to rotate it since you can't read it from one side. It says on caffeine, but it's by On the Media, the program On the Media. So it's particularly attuned to today's topic of conversation. Plus, it's about coffee.
Right. 2 of our favorite things.
So some weeks I stretch the mug a little.
Yeah.
This week, it's about watching the media, protecting the media, thinking about the media.
Well, guys, we only have 3 questions, I think, because they were just so interested in listening, but
It's an amazing.
add some more. Usually we have too many. So I'm going to go ahead and dig right in. And Sydney, our young Sydney,
Sydney.
we're still trying to figure out if
Youngest
she's
person.
younger than Sydney or if she gets the youth prize this week. Sydney asked, should we be suspicious or cautious of the government because of their desire to control the free press or cover up certain information?
Well, we should always be watchful of the government. You know, it's hard to, in some cases, it's hard to make absolute statements, but if the question really is, I see someone talking to me down below and I can't see it because I'm answering a question, so I'll come back. I saw my name. But if the question is, should we watch out for other instances in which the government is going to try to silence or repress people from saying something? Is that the question, that going
Yeah,
forward?
I think what she's asking is, should we be suspicious or cautious, like always be on high alert when we see clues that the government might be covering something up or controlling the press?
We should be watchful. We should be watchful. I mean, I hesitate to say high alert because I always feel as though I'm on high alert. I haven't been off high alert for many years. And there are levels of alert, but always watchful, always wary, always quick to note something that seems suspicious, watchful of what's happening, and encouraged and inspired, if it seems suspicious to you, to say something.
Yeah, I think I was a little kid when Watergate was happening. I didn't quite understand it till I got older. I think I've told that story before. I thought it was the soap operas that my grandma used to watch after school because she and my mother were glued to the TV when we came home on the school bus every day. And then we realized it wasn't a soap opera that they were watching. And it was really like, I was like, where's Erica Kane? Why isn't she kissing or slapping somebody across the face?
All my children.
Yeah, because my grandma watched her stories every day. And she said, Anne, this is not a soap opera. This is really happening. Our government's falling apart. And I was like, well, that's boring. I like Erica Kane. She kisses people and she slaps them.
Yeah, I didn't watch a lot of Watergate.
Yeah, and I was
I
really
didn't
little.
fully understand what was
I
happening.
didn't either. But then when I got into I guess it was 7th grade history, maybe, they were talking, you know, it was still pretty recent history then. And I was like, wait a minute, those are those soap operas my grandma used to watch. But I think to me, that's my first memory of people not trusting their government, right? And
Well,
they-
so the person
I think
in your life is what you're saying. Yeah.
yeah.
I'm trying to
Okay,
catch
so
up.
Dale asks, did the violence in Lawrence contribute in a significant way to Kansas entering the Union as a free state?
Well, it certainly stoked the fight over Kansas. It helps lead to what sometimes is branded bleeding Kansas. So it's certainly a big part of the struggle over the slavery status of Kansas as it's on its way to becoming a state. So, it's cause and effect in this period, like, the fact that the caning of Sumner is a few days after the sacking of Lawrence, you can't necessarily draw a direct line, but they certainly show, in a sense, a fire burning, a fire of a certain sort burning, and they send strong messages. Like literally, the idea that the South is beating the North into submission, in a way, both of those incidents have that kind of connotation.
Yeah. All right. Our good friend Dave asks, which is a bigger problem for democracy? That the First Amendment gives you the right to lie, or a police raid on a newspaper? We're living during a fire hose of lies by people in power.
Definite fire hose of lies, but read the question again.
Oh, which one is a bigger problem for democracy? That the First Amendment gives you the right to lie, or that a police raid on a newspaper? Between those two.
Oh, which is worse?
Yeah.
Well, there have always been lies in the press in American history, right? I mean, it's not as though there was a golden past when everyone in the press told the truth and everything was hunky-dory, and then suddenly people began to lie. Go back in time, go online, go to Founders Online that has all of the papers, the writings of the founders, and look up newspapers under, for example, within Thomas Jefferson's writings, and what you'll see is him, I never read a newspaper, they're all full of lies, rant, particularly when he's president. So it's not great that you can lie, but it's better to allow people to say what they want and then deal with the repercussions of that than to hold people back from saying what they want to say. So I don't think, a free press is worse. The other example, the other half of that was what? Either I keep making you go back in time to find the question. It was either stopping.
Was it the First Amendment giving him the right to lie, or the police raid on the newspaper?
Oh, okay, yes. So the police raid is the short answer, because lying is lying, but that police raid and what it represents as far as the relationship between the press and government, as far as the ability of the newspaper to say things that the government might not like, that says a lot, and that's really disturbing. And I saw someone here, I've now missed it. Someone, maybe it was Carol Lee, used the word norms. I thought about that word when I was, and I forgot to write it down when I was thinking about this episode, because the Washington Post makes the statement, police raids on news organizations are almost unknown and are illegal under most circumstances. Almost unknown, illegal under most circumstances. This isn't entirely a norm, but it certainly sort of fits under that rubric. This is not a thing that's supposed to happen. This feels like a norm that a free press is protected and that the police don't raid newspapers, right? So I don't know, you can go back to the beginning probably of History Matters and find me talking about norms and the violation of norms and the ways in which, to a different degree than I ever knew before, I understand the vital importance of norms for democratic governance and the many ways in which they're just norms. So if they're violated, then what? We see that all the time. We saw that particularly beginning under Trump's presidency. And I remember a former, actually, it was Brian Ballo, who was one of my co-hosts on Backstory and was one of my professors when I was in grad school. And we were talking, and he acknowledged what I was thinking, which was, this is really giving me a sort of visceral gut understanding of what the violation of norms really means. I had been thinking that, and I had not been voicing that because I thought, oh, shucks, naive me, like a senior historian wouldn't say that. It's like, no, actually.
Yeah. I put a couple of backstory segments in the chat while you were talking that came to mind about a free press. You guys had some really good ones, so I threw those in. Okay, so George is asking, hi, George. What actions did Abraham Lincoln take regarding the press? Interesting.
I do not have the answer to that. I know that when the Southerners moved north, the Confederates, and were trying to take control of whatever city they were in, but particularly Washington, they cut telegraph lines, right? They immediately, railroad tracks and telephone lines, but particularly telegraph lines. Again, block them in, cut off the information. I've talked before on a different episode about the press. I talked about how the struggle over slavery coinciding with the rise of the telegraph is really fascinating. I've said this before too, fascinated by technology and democracy and how those two things intertwine. In the case of the telegraph, you have the building struggle over the place of slavery within the United States. And then just as that's really taking off, very, very late 1840s, moving into 1850s, the telegraph begins to come to the fore. And the telegraph does several things that make this a big problem in a way that it wasn't before, make this struggle a big problem. It can reach much further than anything could reach before, as far as spreading news, right? So the news can get beyond where it ever went before. You have people, journalists in Washington who no one knows, right? Before it was kind of like a community because it was people who were either relatively close or the same people coming again and again that were recognizable. Now, because of the telegraph, you can have a journalist from very far away here and sending news back home. And it's sending that news really, really quickly, right? So quickly. And people, there's lots of newspapers that you can tell they're publishing news, and very often on the front page, it'll say telegraphic, right? It's like, oh, look at this. And they're publishing news in part just so they can say, not that long ago, this happened. Oh, update. Now this happened. So all of that, the news spreading faster, the news spreading further at a moment when a national crisis is rising to new heights. That, again, it's an example of a free press and a powerful press spreading information that heightens the struggle, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't have the free press spreading information, right? I mean, it does ultimately cause bigger problems, but the bigger problem is simply that North and South, this is one of the bigger problems. In a sense, North and South now have a better sense, not only of what the national government is doing, but what North and South think of each other, right? There's an incident I write about in which a northern member of Congress goes back, I guess he's from Massachusetts, and gives some kind of anti-slavery speech, a roaring anti-slavery speech, and then comes back to Washington, goes back to Congress, and I'm simplifying this to an extreme degree, but a Southern member of Congress essentially stands up and says, because the Telegraph spread that speech all the way down to Washington, even probably before this guy got back, Southern member says, do you really think you can go to Massachusetts and call me a barbarian and then come back down here, shake my hand, and work on a committee with me? Really? Do you think that's going to happen? So the Telegraph, it tangles everything. And that's in part because of the ways in which it interacts with the news, with the spread of knowledge, and ultimately, in this period as ours, with politics. Obviously, I love this stuff, but it's fascinating, right? Because and much has been written about this, and I'm not going to go on and on and on, but you could say the same thing about the radio. You can say the same thing about TV, civil rights struggle, 1960s, steam-powered printing presses. All of these things end up having a big influence because information becomes more powerful. And if information is more powerful, politics is going to become trickier, potentially more charged, and more accountable.
Maybe we need a technology episode in a future History Matters. Everybody's getting excited. They say you get really animated when you talk about technology in the chat.
I do. I always do. And that's actually a good idea. I will store that away. And
They said especially the Telegraph. They say whenever you talk about the Telegraph, it's like you just love it.
I do. But you know, that's very funny that shows. Part of the reason why it gets me so animated is in the course of writing my book, you could see, like you could just see the impact, right? It wasn't like, oh, let me consider like a historian, like this appears, it was like, oh no, you know, wow. And people in Washington don't know what to do, and newspaper people are talking about it. So it's like very satisfying because it's a technological change, has a really obvious political impact, and people are talking about it. So I do love it. I do love just the idea. And as I said at the beginning, I love, someone said, get her a Telegraph technology mug.
I know, I thought.
But because in a sense, technology, people don't necessarily always tie it up in with democracy. I find the whole thing fascinating. It's part of why whenever anything interesting technologically, meaning through streaming or something else, when that happens on TV, I'm going to stay up all night watching it, right? I'm just going to be there like, oh, you know, like this, like with the indictment, watching the clerk walk the indictment into the elevator down to the courtroom. I'm tweeting, we're watching the person walk into an elevator. How is this? Or the it was an anti-gun protest, I believe, in the House, and the cameras in the House were turned off to prevent that from being spread. And so people in the room, members of Congress, took out their cell phones and used their cell phones to broadcast what was happening. That, you can imagine how excited I get by technology. That blew me away. I just stayed and I just watched it forever, because that was members of Congress just bypassing the press, right? Whatever, do what you want. We're going to talk to the people. In a sense,
people need to know what your elected officials are doing and how they're representing you.
Absolutely. But in a sense, social media does a version of that, right? Like, we're going to go directly to the people. To heck with anything else, the press, you know, people who are going to like edit what we're doing. Direct link to the people. That's democratically really powerful. And in that case, in the case of the cell phones broadcasting what was happening, that just to me represented the kind of moment that years from now, if people are writing about democracy and technology, or even more broadly about the fate of democracy in this time period, that moment of broadcasting what we saw, broadcasting what was going on in the Capitol about a very intense issue, gun control, broadcasting that to the nation and bypassing all the regular channels directly to the people. If I were a historian, I would leap at that. I would just show that as a moment in which certain norms are being norms in a different sense, but assumptions about what happens when you're reporting on Congress are being violated. Look at that and look at the implications of that. And slightly different, but think about social media. You know, we live the implications of that all the time. People say things that they shouldn't say on social media. People spread things and maybe they're true and maybe they're false, but they lead to all kinds of trouble. We had a tweeting president of a different sort than our current president, who occasionally tweets. Anyway, okay, I'm like so excited I can't stop talking.
Oh, we got more questions. Okay. Good. Bobby, hi Bobby. Bobby asked, is there a possibility that Real News, as defined by Joanne, can force channels, and she names one specifically, but I'm just going to say, I don't want to like just
a cable channel.
A cable channel, because there's more than one that does this, to change their name to blank entertainment instead of blank news, right? Like, should they have to be up front and say, we're not a serious news organization? I think what they're calling it now is infotainment. I've seen that in the right. Magazines and newspapers. But I would make the case, Bobby, that pretty much all the cable channels are now infotainment, because they've all catered to one side or the other. There doesn't seem to be hardly any in the middle anymore, at least to me, Joanne. I don't know, but you're the historian, so I'll be quiet.
Well, I would say if, when asked, you define your channel as being for entertainment or infotainment, as supposedly Fox did, then it should be known, right? I mean, I don't, and I say that at the same time recognizing in a different part of my brain, a lot of people just won't care, right? I mean, and that's, again, this is not a new problem. And you can find all kinds of ranting about newspapers going all the way back. Obviously, it happens before the United States, but if you're talking about the United States, to the very beginnings of the Republic, and even in the colonial era, right? That's what happens, and people can't tell what's true. I remember finding a letter from the 1790s, and I believe it was to someone in Massachusetts, might be wrong. Anyway, it's a letter between two politically minded people, and one of them says, I don't have any, it's actually, I think, a Massachusetts person he's being written to, and he's writing back to a newspaper man in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia guy has said, I don't have any news from overseas, like the ship hasn't come, I don't have anything to say about foreign news. And typically in a newspaper in this period, you have foreign news, national news, local news, and then commerce and poetry in the back. So it's a part of the newspaper. The editor's like, I don't have anything to say. And the other person says, make it up. And he's not even like, make it up. He's just like, okay, just make it up. So much. If you ever, and you can do this if you have access to databases, you can see this in almost any politically minded newspaper from the 1790s. A story will start with, a friend of mine writes and says, or a reputable gentleman in Pennsylvania says. The news is, I heard from a person that. And it's always a person, either the person knows, or it's reputable, or it's trustworthy. Who knows if any of that is true? But they're trying to say, yes, no, this is a good source. You can trust this, because that's a problem then too, which is a very roundabout way of saying, I think if you say when asked, oh yeah, we're largely for entertainment, that should be, it should be part of what you're identified as a channel. But I'm sure there are many things bound up with that are not ideal. And I also think to many, many people, it wouldn't matter anyway. Did who here has seen the movie Network? Okay, if you haven't, watch it.
Yeah.
It's about news entertainment and the destruction of the news from a long time ago. And at one point, there's a sort of older newspaper man who screams, I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. And I remember at some point in college, freshman year, I was so frustrated, I leaned out the window. I'm mad as hell. I'm not going to take it anymore. I don't know if anyone actually responded, but it felt very good.
Yeah, there's this history at the movies thing on Sunday nights. I don't know if you've ever participated in that before, but
oh yeah.
Yeah. I was just thinking they could do a double feature of Network and All the President's Men, like a whole journalism night.
Wow. Yeah.
Sydney, our young Sydney, if you haven't seen either one, that's your homework this weekend. You got to watch both those. I'll watch them with you online. Okay. Let's see. Ellen asks, could you comment on the general decline of newspapers and getting news from fewer and fewer sources? The lack of in-depth coverage from all but a few outlets seems to be increasing threat to our country.
I think it is. I think the lack of local newspapers, the fact that there aren't people on the ground seeing what's happened in different localities and able to report that, the fact that if you are someplace, where do you go for news if you don't have a local newspaper? And obviously the fact that if there are large corporations buying up small newspapers, that becomes a problem. Are you then going to have like this wonderfully, sarcastically, sort of news that agrees with itself everywhere? Local newspapers are vitally important. And I know people have been saying for years, this is a crisis. This is a crisis. Local papers are going down. It is. It's about a lack of accountability on a spreading level. It's about the inability to get news, particularly local news, but any news on a local level. I had a third thing that went right out of my head. I did that once during a conference and I was so mortified. I have 3 reasons, 1, 2, but I was jet lagged. I'd flown to England. I'm just going to pretend like I didn't have a third one. At any rate, the larger,
I'm not good at math. It doesn't matter.
yeah, good. Just forget it. I think I needed more coffee before I did this episode. But it clearly it's fundamentally important. It has to do with accountability, democracy, and informing the American people of what's going on. And again, we've talked about this before. I might as well say this about everything. Since at this point, episode 177, we've talked about everything before. Wow, I just forgot where I was going again. Eddie, man.
We need more coffee, Joanne.
I definitely need more coffee. We have talked about this before. I don't know what's going on with me. Hang on a sec.
It's funny you were talking about that and Ellen's question about the news. So I'm just going to put in a plug for school newspapers because my brother is a professional journalist. He's retired now, but he started in our high school newspaper. And then my older sister and I were also editors after him, different generations. It's like 3 decades of, but when I was the editor of our high school paper, Peter Baker, who's now at the New York Times, was my co-editor. And he went on to have like this huge career in journalism. And I think about all the weird stuff that like little high school journalists fixate on.
But sometimes they make national news.
Yes. And I remember we covered a school shooting. This was, back in the early 80s, way before Columbine, way before that. This was unfortunately an every week occurrence. But there was someone that had a gun at one of the high schools in Fairfax County. And our journalism teacher let us leave school and drive over there to cover the story. And there were 3 other high school newspapers there. And we were staying there with the Washington Post, the Washington Star.
Well, that's the point. That's the ultimate example of a local newspaper.
Yeah. And they weren't going to let us in because we were kids. And I remember there was someone from the Washington Star there. And I said, my brother was an intern at the Washington Star. He'd be so mad at you if you don't let us in the press corps. And that guy from the Washington Star took an extra badge and clipped it on us and let us in the press with the big adults.
Okay, but that's the point that I'm making here, is that it's an example, very local, if it's school journalists, but still it's an example of being on the ground, being in the moment, and being able to report, since you know that place, since you know that area, what's going on with special knowledge, right? That part of what I was going to say and what I forgot about was the fact that so much organization, so much protest, and in many ways, the most successful political movements, they begin on the ground, they begin locally, they don't begin nationally. So local is really important. As a matter of fact, go all the way back to de Tocqueville, wandering in the early 19th century around the United States. And one of the things that puzzled Americans and people overseas was they're so spread out. They're all over the place. Like, what's going to hold this together? Actually, the press was one thing that might, but Tocqueville says, they form all these little societies and clubs. And somehow that brings people together into groups. And somehow that helps hold things together. There's always, in a spread out federal republic, you need the local as a fundamental part of the whole. So yeah, it's for good reason that people scream about local newspapers going down. If you are somewhere with a local paper that's having trouble, support your local paper. It's a massive problem, and I would encourage you, actually, this is a worthwhile thing to do a little bit of research into, because I'm sure you will find stories. I didn't do any looking like this before, obviously, on a specific level of what happens when the local newspaper goes down. And one of the risks is the standardization of the news, right? If one corporation buys lots of local papers or shuts down a lot of local papers, that corporation can help standardize what's getting out into the world. I can't remember the name of the company that controls what goes to military bases. But I remember there was a controversy over that, that was a company that was like sending a message out to everyone, not necessarily to military bases, but I'm not going to be able to recall the details. At any rate, okay, I'll stop. We only have 1 or 2 minutes left.
Yeah, now we have a flood of questions. Okay, I'm gonna bump up my friend Nathan McAllister because he works with teachers and I love him and it tickles me that he's with us today. Okay, Nathan asked, do you fear that the normalizing of this behavior could happen in the classroom through twisted state social studies standards? I do, Nathan. I can't wait to hear what Joanne says about that. I worry about that every day.
Here's what I think. I think the point of the raid of the newspaper offices, the point of hazily identified book bans, the point of weird sweeping statements about what's allowed to be taught, the point of all of that is to intimidate people into shutting up and not saying what they want to say. Right. In one way or another, what's going on is people are trying to stop students from reading and learning certain information, stop teachers from teaching and explaining certain information. And today we just talked about preventing certain information from getting out. Yeah, I absolutely think that the general dynamic of what I'm talking about today absolutely is in the classroom, and it all has to do with, and it's really at the heart of my last book, intimidation. It's intimidation. It's to make you scared to teach something, or to have a certain book in your school class library, or to teach a certain course. I don't know if any of you saw Little Rock, Arkansas is going to teach AP African American history. I just read that this morning. Of course, Little Rock,
Yep.
where the Little Rock Nine helped to desegregate the schools. So the fact that Little Rock has said, we're doing this is amazing. But there's a case in which, you know, I think Little Rock is going to pay for the AP exams, right? Because the state said, yep, sorry, we don't support that anymore. So in one way or another, democracy and information, democracy can't exist without the spread of information in that way. And learning is a way of spreading information and teaching people to open the boundaries of their thought and put more things, understand the bigger context of things, and put new information in their brains and reason for themselves. And in the case of classrooms, see things that in the past that were ugly, that are problematic, and helped lead to today. You know, when people say, this will be the last thing, we're 2 minutes over. When people say, you know, we can't teach things in classrooms that will make students uncomfortable, they're not worried about the students being uncomfortable. They themselves are uncomfortable. Right? They're like, oh, we don't want to teach about racism. I don't want that. People shouldn't know about racism. Don't teach about it. The kids, you know, that's a different story. So that just, okay, now I'm getting excited in a different way, and 2 minutes pass. So I'm going to stop, and we're going to move on, and we'll see, maybe next week, depending on what people asked.
Okay, we still got some really good questions. We've got 12 now. Before we only had 3, and now we've got 12.
Okay, well, I can look at them and we can think about next week. But at any rate, here's what's going to happen now. We are going to move to the after party. What that means is that we will stop recording so that we can be even freer and easier in our conversation, because it will not be recorded. If you came in through the NCHE website, just stay here and poof, you will be in the after party. I can say poof without someone getting bingo.
No.
Which is sad, but I said it, and in the back of my brain, it was like, I don't have to watch for the bingos.
Oh, I won.
I know. Woo-hoo. If you're on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations. And that will take you to the after party as well, where we can talk about whatever people want to talk about. So thank you, John. Thank you, Annie. For those of you who can't stick around for the after party. Oh, someone is sad about their question. I feel bad if we missed it, so I'll look towards next week. I don't mean to let anyone down with not asking their question. I wish all of you a wonderful week. Certainly a good week to just keep watching the news, right? There's so much happening that now, you know, it used to be that I just couldn't think of what I wanted to talk about and I would wait till Thursday. Now I sometimes feel like I gotta wait to see what happens last week.
But we have some
good
good
job.
questions. So if you wanted to do a part 2 again with this, I think this is a hot topic.
Okay.
Don,
at
please
any
send us
rate-
the extra questions because I don't have a way to save them like you did last time.
Right.
Send us the questions.
At any rate, have a good week. Thank you for taking part in the conversation of democracy. I appreciate all of you. The topics that we're addressing are pretty central. And in essence, we are taking part in democracy. We're definitely talking about democracy and the spreading of an understanding of democracy, what it is, how it works, and our rights within it can't be more important than it is right now. So, okay, have a wonderful week, and I will see you guys next week. Bye, everybody.